It was about 1 year ago when my brother and I were in Charlottesville and we had a conversation with somebody that we had just met. And it was a good conversation, exchanging ideas on who Jesus was. But once they realized that we were Christian, suddenly the conversation shifted and they were becoming resistant, and it was they were trying to leave the conversation. And so the question remains, what happened in that conversation that caused that shift to happen? And social judgment theory can shed some light on that. Social judgment theory is also known as social judgment involvement theory, and also assimilation contrast theory, and those names will be evident when we go through the elements that are involved in social judgment theory. The main contributors of this theory are Muzafer Sherif, Carl Hovland, and Carolyn Sherif, who started developing this theory more along the lines of perception, and then it moved into social norms, and then it fully developed into what we now mainly use it for, and that is focusing on attitude change. So the first element we're going to look at is attitude. And this isn't necessarily a hot-headed teenager type of attitude we're looking at. It's basically a position or a perspective that somebody takes on an issue. The Elsevier's Dictionary of Psychological Theories describes it this way. An attitude is a learned predisposition or set to evaluate or react consistently in a particular manner, either positively or negatively, to certain persons, places, concepts, things, or events. So again, it's more of a position and perspective on a certain topic. And where that attitude is on the spectrum, whether it's on this extreme or that extreme or right in the middle, social judgment theory focuses on the attitude change, which is when somebody changes their position to a different one. And so the continuum I'm talking about, they label as latitudes of acceptance, non-commitment, and rejection. So latitude of acceptance focuses on topics and ideas that the individual agrees with, different positions within that latitude. Rejection is the opposite, those things that they reject. And non-commitment is basically those things that they haven't made a final decision on just yet. And so that's the area where attitude change can take place more often than not, because there hasn't been a final decision made, and so the person may be more willing to listen and think through what you're saying. And width matters. And we'll talk about width when we discuss another element. But the next element that we're going to focus on is message discrepancy. And this is when basically the message from the source is different than the position that the receiver holds. And Jennifer Monahan, in Communication and Social Cognition, written in 2007, explains it this way. She says that the message discrepancy is the difference between the position advocated by the source and the pre-message of attitude of receivers. And so the pre-message is where, before the message is even given, this person has a position, has an attitude towards this topic, and that can greatly affect how it's received. And so there was a study done by Clark and Wegner in 2009 that actually found that despite message discrepancy, other factors are involved too, like source credibility and the relationship between the source and the receiver. And so there's other factors involved, but the one example I want to give is the fictional Jesus versus historical Jesus. And so, as in the conversation my brother and I had with that individual, if we're explaining the proposition of a historical Jesus and she already has her mind made up on a fictional Jesus, there's going to be a message discrepancy there. And so when it comes to message production, how do we shape our messages? understanding this theory can help in that, because we're also looking at how it affects other people, how their perspectives are already in play before we get started. Another thing that we have to consider with the receiver is their ego involvement. And this is basically how personally and emotionally invested an individual is with that certain topic. And so some could explain this as a person who's stuck in their ways. And that doesn't always have to be a bad thing, because when let's say a Christian is holding to a sound biblical truth, compromising that truth would not be the best option. And so, yes, they have a high ego involvement. They're very personally and emotionally invested in that position. And so here we see a high ego involvement typically shows a wide latitude of rejection, because they already have their mind made up. They have a narrow latitude of acceptance. They're focused on what they hold to, versus somebody who has a low ego involvement, which typically results in a wide latitude of acceptance, because they're more open and willing to hear out an idea because they're not totally invested in that. And so another way that social judgment theory plays into all this is assimilation and contrast effect. And this is taking it a step further, where on that spectrum somebody has an anchor point by which they judge and perceive the messages coming in. And if it's in their latitude of acceptance, then they may actually see it as closer than what it really is, kind of like a side view mirror. Objects appear closer than what they really are. The contrast effect is when it falls in their latitude of rejection, and then they view it as something further away than what it really is. And then a third effect is the boomerang effect, which again, if it falls in their latitude of acceptance, it might bring them closer to that position, but if it's in their latitude of rejection, then it might push them away. And that's why politicians sometimes use ambiguous language to avoid those extremes and try and create the most attitude change that they can. And so, is it a good theory? Littlejohn and Foss would agree that it is, because they lay out 4 criteria for what makes up a good theory, and social judgment theory definitely falls in line with all 4 of those. It provides insights that we would not normally have. It is conceptually interesting. It has hallmarks and has a history, and it definitely plays into many different areas of study that researchers have cited this theory multiple times. And so finally, when you think about it with a sports team, when you're cheering for your own team that you're personally and emotionally invested in, you have high ego involvement with them. If a call is made in favor of the other team, we can get upset and say, what a terrible call that was. But if the exact same call was made on our team, we might say, oh, that was a pretty good call. And so that's how social judgment theory kind of works, where attitude, ego involvement, message discrepancy, and where it falls on that latitude all plays a role in how we perceive a message, and if that message will affect attitude change for us. And so finally, with the gospel, again, it comes back to where that person is on that spectrum and how we show it. So social judgment theory has a huge role in all of this, and it's a good theory, and it's worth studying.